The fog hung thick over the Argonne forest on the morning of September 26, 1918, but it could not muffle the sound that would soon shake the earth. Private Thomas Murphy pressed his face against the cold mud of the trench wall, listening to the ghostly silence that preceded what would become America's bloodiest battle. In just minutes, over 2,700 American artillery pieces would unleash hell upon the German lines, marking the beginning of the Meuse Argonne offensive. General John Joseph Pershing stood in his command post, studying the maps that detailed the most ambitious American operation of the Great War. The American Expeditionary Forces had been given a sector 24 miles wide, stretching from the Meuse River to the western edge of the Argonne forest. Their mission was simple in concept but devastating in execution: break through the Hindenburg line and drive the Germans back toward their homeland. What lay ahead was a maze of trenches, machine gun nests, and defensive positions that the Germans had spent 4 years perfecting. The German Fourth Army, commanded by General Friedrich von Lossberg, had transformed the Argonne forest into a fortress of death. According to military historians from the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, the Germans had constructed multiple defensive lines, each more formidable than the last. The first line alone contained over 500 machine gun positions, expertly positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that could cut down advancing infantry like wheat before a scythe. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, the American barrage began. The sound was unlike anything the world had ever heard, a continuous roar that could be heard over 100 miles away in Paris. Shells weighing as much as small automobiles arced through the misty air, their trajectories traced by tongues of fire that momentarily illuminated the pre-dawn darkness. The German positions disappeared under a curtain of explosions that sent geysers of earth, steel, and human remains skyward. Sergeant William Hayes of the 77th Division watched the bombardment from his position in the front trench. The vibrations from the artillery fire made his teeth ache, and the constant flash of explosions turned the world into a hellish strobe light. Around him, his men checked their rifles, fixed bayonets, and tried to ignore the butterflies in their stomachs. Many had never seen combat before. They were farm boys from Kansas, factory workers from Detroit, and college students from New England who had answered their country's call to arms. The preliminary bombardment lasted 3 hours, transforming the German front lines into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. When the guns finally fell silent at 8:30, the sudden quiet was almost more unnerving than the noise had been. Officers blew their whistles, and along a 24-mile front, over 200,000 American soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward the German lines. The first day would see remarkable success in some sectors and devastating failure in others. The American First Army, comprising 9 divisions in the first assault wave, managed to advance between 1 and 3 miles in most areas. However, this initial success came at a terrible cost. By nightfall on September 26th, over 4,000 American soldiers lay dead or wounded in the churned mud of no man's land. And the bloodiest chapter in American military history had only just begun. The Argonne forest had earned a new name among the American soldiers, the Green Hell. As the second day of the offensive dawned on September 27, 1918, the initial optimism of the American command began to give way to grim reality. The forest itself had become an enemy as deadly as the Germans who defended it. Major Charles Whittlesey of the 77th Division led his battalion deeper into the maze of trees, undergrowth, and German fortifications that honeycombed the forest floor. The Argonne was unlike any battlefield the Americans had encountered. Dense vegetation limited visibility to mere yards, making artillery support nearly impossible and turning every advance into a deadly game of blind man's bluff. German machine gunners, hidden in camouflaged positions, could remain undetected until they opened fire. often from behind the advancing Americans. The German defensive strategy, perfected over 4 years of trench warfare, relied on a system called defense in depth. Rather than manning a single strong line, they had created multiple defensive zones, each designed to slow, channel, and ultimately destroy the attacking forces. When American troops overran the first line of trenches, they often found themselves advancing into carefully prepared killing fields where German artillery had pre-registered every possible target. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, commanding a tank brigade in support of the infantry, quickly discovered that armored warfare in the Argonne presented unique challenges. His Renault tanks, weighing 6.5 tons each, struggled through the soft forest floor and became easy targets for German anti-tank weapons. According to records from the United States Army Center of Military History, mechanical failures plagued the tank units, with nearly 40% of the armored vehicles breaking down before engaging the enemy. The fighting in the forest took on a character unlike anything seen on the Western Front. Small units of infantry, sometimes no larger than a squad, would find themselves isolated and surrounded as they advanced through the thick vegetation. Communications broke down almost immediately as telephone wires were cut by artillery fire, and runners carrying messages between units often never returned from their desperate journeys through the forest. Private First Class Henry Johnson of the 369th Infantry Regiment, one of the African-American units fighting with distinction in the offensive, described the forest fighting in letters home that would later be preserved by the National Archives. He wrote of combat so close and personal that soldiers could hear their enemies breathing in the darkness, of machine gun bullets that splintered trees and sent deadly wooden fragments flying like shrapnel, and of the constant fear that came from knowing that death could strike from any direction at any moment. The German defenders, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, employed every trick they had learned in 4 years of warfare. They allowed American units to pass by hidden positions, then opened fire from behind. They used the forest's natural acoustics to their advantage, firing from one position and then quickly moving to another, creating the impression of being under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. By the end of the second day, American casualties had climbed to over 8,000, and the advance had slowed to a crawl. General Pershing, under pressure from his French and British allies to maintain the momentum of the offensive, ordered his commanders to press the attack regardless of losses. The decision would prove costly, as American units, already exhausted and depleted, were thrown into increasingly desperate assaults against well-prepared German positions. The forest floor became a carpet of American dead and wounded, their olive-drab uniforms blending grotesquely with the autumn leaves. Medical corpsmen, identifiable by the red crosses on their helmets, moved through the carnage under constant fire, dragging wounded soldiers to aid stations that were themselves under regular bombardment. October 2nd, 1918, brought one of the most harrowing episodes of the entire Meuse-Argonne offensive. Major Charles Whittlesey and his battalion of the 77th Division had pushed deeper into the Argonne forest than any other American unit, following what they believed were retreating German forces. Instead, they had walked into a carefully prepared trap that would make them legendary as the Lost Battalion. Whittlesey's force consisted of approximately 550 men from the 308th Infantry Regiment, along with elements from several other units. They had advanced nearly a mile beyond the positions of friendly forces on either flank, occupying a small depression on the slopes of Hill 269. As dawn broke, they discovered to their horror that German forces had quietly reoccupied the positions behind them during the night, completely cutting them off from the rest of the American army. The German 45th Reserve Division, under the command of General Wellman, had orchestrated the encirclement with precision. They had allowed the American battalion to penetrate their lines, then closed the trap behind them. Now Whittlesey and his men found themselves surrounded by an estimated 3,000 German soldiers who controlled all the high ground around. Their position: the first German attack came at noon, preceded by a devastating artillery barrage that sent ancient oak trees crashing down upon the Americans. The men dug shallow foxholes with their bare hands and entrenching tools, creating whatever protection they could from the rain of high explosive shells. When the barrage lifted, German infantry advanced from 3 directions, their gray uniforms barely visible through the smoke and vegetation. Private First Class Abraham Krotoszyński, a Polish immigrant who had volunteered for the American Army, found himself manning a machine gun position at the northern edge of the American perimeter. As German soldiers advanced through the trees, he held his fire until they were within 50 yards, then opened up with devastating effect. His Lewis gun cut down the first wave of attackers, but within minutes, German snipers had identified his position and began targeting him with rifle fire that chipped bark from the trees around his head, according to documentation held by the National World War I Museum and Memorial. The surrounded Americans faced not only the German army, but also the elements and their own army's artillery. On October 4th, American gunners, unaware of the battalion's exact location, began shelling the area where Whittlesey's men were trapped. The friendly fire killed several Americans and wounded many more, adding to the agony of their situation. Communication with the outside world became Whittlesey's greatest challenge. All telephone lines had been cut, and runners attempting to carry messages through German lines were either killed or captured. In desperation, Whittlesey turned to the signal corps' most unusual communication method: carrier pigeons. The birds, trained to fly back to American headquarters, represented the battalion's only hope of survival. The most famous of these birds was a pigeon named Cher Ami, who would become a legend in his own right. When released with a message describing the American artillery falling on their own positions, Cher Ami was shot through the breast by German rifle fire but continued flying. The bird lost one leg and was blinded in one eye, but managed to deliver the message that saved the lost battalion from destruction by their own guns. Food and water became critical concerns as the siege continued. The Americans had carried only one day's rations when they advanced, expecting to be resupplied quickly. Now, with German forces controlling all approaches to their position, starvation became as deadly an enemy as German bullets. Men sucked water from muddy shell craters and chewed on leather from their equipment in desperate attempts to survive. German psychological warfare added another dimension to the Americans' torment. Loudspeakers broadcast surrender demands in English, promising good treatment for prisoners of war. When these failed, the Germans tried a different approach, playing American popular songs and shouting the names of captured American soldiers. To demoralize the defenders, October 7, 1918, marked the beginning of the most intense fighting of the entire Meuse-Argonne offensive. General Pershing, facing mounting criticism from his Allied commanders and pressure from Washington to end the stalemate, ordered a massive assault along the entire front. The American First Army, now reinforced to over 1 million men, prepared for what many hoped would be the final push to break German resistance. The German defensive positions had grown stronger with each passing day. General Georg von der Marwitz, who had assumed command of the German Fifth Army, had used the lull in major fighting to construct new defensive lines and bring up reserves. The Germans had also introduced a new weapon that would prove devastatingly effective against American infantry: mustard gas delivered by artillery shells that created persistent chemical clouds in the forest undergrowth. Colonel Douglas MacArthur, commanding the 84th Infantry Brigade of the 42nd Rainbow Division, led one of the first assaults of the renewed offensive. His objective was a heavily fortified German position known as the Cape de Catalan, a hill that dominated the surrounding countryside and served as a key observation post for German artillery. The position was defended by elements of the German 5th Guard Division, elite troops who had fought on every major front of the war. The assault began at dawn with the largest artillery barrage the American Army had yet conducted. Over 4,000 guns fired simultaneously, creating a wall of explosions that extended 5 miles behind German lines. The barrage was so intense that it could be felt in Paris, over 100 miles away, where windows rattled in their frames. And civilians thought they were experiencing an earthquake when the artillery lifted. Waves of American infantry emerged from their trenches and advanced across no man's land. The ground they crossed was a hellscape of shell craters, tangled barbed wire, and the decomposing bodies of soldiers from previous attacks. Gas masks made breathing difficult and limited vision, while the persistent threat of German chemical weapons forced soldiers to keep their masks on for hours at a time. The German response was immediate and devastating. Machine guns that had survived the barrage opened fire from concealed positions, creating the deadly crossfire that had characterized trench warfare throughout the conflict. American soldiers fell by the hundreds as they struggled through the cocktail wire obstacles that the Germans had spent months perfecting. According to records maintained by the United States Army Heritage and Education Center, some American units suffered casualty rates exceeding 70% in the first hour of the assault. Sergeant Alvin York of the 82nd Division would achieve immortality during this phase of the battle. Leading a patrol tasked with silencing German machine gun nests, York found himself in a position where his exceptional marksmanship skills could make a decisive difference. Using a rifle technique he had perfected hunting turkeys in the mountains of Tennessee, York systematically eliminated German machine gunners who were pinning down American troops. The fighting for individual German positions often lasted for hours, with American soldiers having to clear each bunker and trench line through close combat. Hand grenades became the weapon of choice in the confined spaces of German fortifications, and bitter hand-to-hand fighting with bayonets, clubs, and even bare fists determined the outcome of many engagements. Medical personnel faced unprecedented challenges during this phase of the battle. The combination of high-explosive shells, machine gun fire, and chemical weapons created wounds that Army doctors had never encountered. Field hospitals, located in hastily constructed bunkers and abandoned German positions, operated under constant fire as German artillery targeted anything that showed signs of American activity. The psychological toll on American soldiers began to manifest in increasing numbers of what military doctors termed shell shock cases. Men who had endured weeks of constant bombardment and combat began exhibiting symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The Army's response was typically harsh, with many soldiers suffering from psychological trauma, being accused of cowardice and threatened with court-martial. Despite the enormous casualties, American forces began achieving significant breakthroughs by October 10th. The sheer weight of numbers and the increasing shortage of German reserves began to tell. American units that had been fighting for 2 weeks were reinforced with fresh troops, while German defenders had no such luxury. The tide of battle was slowly but inexorably turning in favor of the American forces. October 14th, 1918, dawned with the sound of German artillery falling on American positions. But for the first time since the offensive began, the bombardment seemed less intense. Intelligence reports indicated that German ammunition supplies were running critically low, and American forces prepared for what many hoped would be the decisive assault of the entire campaign. The Hindenburg Line, Germany's supposedly impregnable defensive system, stretched across the American sector like a concrete and steel barrier designed to stop any assault. Constructed over 3 years, it represented the pinnacle of German defensive engineering, with bunkers capable of withstanding direct hits from the heaviest artillery, shells, and interconnected tunnels that allowed defenders to move unseen between positions. General Hunter Liggett, who had assumed command of the American First Army from General Pershing, planned the assault with meticulous attention to detail. Unlike previous attacks that had relied primarily on infantry charges across open ground, Liggett coordinated a combined arms assault that integrated artillery, infantry, tanks, and for the first time in the offensive, significant air support. The American Air Service, commanded by Brigadier General William Mitchell, launched the largest aerial operation in American military history to that point. Over 400 aircraft, including fighters, bombers, and observation planes, took to the skies to support the ground assault. German air defenses, weakened by months of fighting and shortages of fuel and replacement aircraft, could offer only token resistance to the American aerial armada. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's leading fighter ace, led a squadron of SPAD fighters in attacks on German observation balloons and aircraft. These missions were crucial to the success of the ground assault, as German aerial observers had been directing devastating artillery fire on American positions. According to records from the National Museum of the United States Air Force, American pilots shot down over 60 German aircraft and balloons during the first day of the renewed offensive. The infantry assault began at 5:45 in the morning, following a rolling barrage that moved forward at a predetermined pace, forcing German defenders to remain in their bunkers, while American troops advanced behind the curtain of explosions. The technique, perfected by British and French forces earlier in the war, required precise timing and coordination between artillery and infantry commanders. The 1st Division, known as the Big Red One, spearheaded the assault on the most heavily fortified section of the Hindenburg Line. Their objective was a complex of German bunkers and trenches that intelligence reports indicated housed over 2,000 defenders equipped with machine guns, mortar, and flamethrowers. The division's commander, Major General Charles Summerall, had warned his men that the assault would require them to fight like hell and never give ground. German resistance was fierce, but showed signs of the strain that 4 years of war had placed on their army. Many of the defenders were young conscripts who had received minimal training, mixed with veterans who were exhausted from constant fighting. The quality of German equipment had also declined, with many machine guns jamming frequently and artillery shells that failed to explode upon impact. Private Joseph Adkisson of the 26th Division described the breakthrough in a letter that would later be preserved by the Library of Congress. He wrote of American soldiers pouring through gaps in the German wire like water through a broken dam, of German soldiers surrendering in groups rather than fighting to the death, and of the sudden realization that the seemingly impregnable German defenses could be overcome through determination and superior numbers. The breakthrough came at 11:30 in the morning when elements of the 42nd Division captured a key German strongpoint known as Hill 242. The position commanded the surrounding countryside, and its capture opened a gap in the German line that American reserves quickly exploited. Within hours, American troops were advancing through terrain that had been in German hands since 1914. Tank warfare finally came into its own during this phase of the battle. American tank crews, many of whom had received their training from French instructors, discovered that their machines were devastatingly effective once they broke through the initial German defenses. The open ground beyond the Hindenburg Line allowed tanks to operate in coordination with infantry, crushing German resistance that might have held up foot soldiers for hours. The psychological impact of the breakthrough was as important as its tactical significance. German soldiers who had been told that the Hindenburg Line was impregnable watched American forces pour through gaps in their defenses, and morale began to collapse throughout the German Fourth Army. Surrender rates increased dramatically, with entire German units laying down their arms rather than. October 21, 1918, marked the beginning of the end for German resistance in the Meuse Argonne sector. What had begun as an orderly withdrawal from advanced positions was rapidly becoming a full-scale retreat as German commanders realized that their defensive lines could no longer hold against the relentless American assault. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding the German army group that included the forces facing the Americans, issued orders for a fighting withdrawal to prepared positions along the Antwerp-Meuse line. However, the speed of the American advance and the deteriorating condition of German units made an orderly retreat nearly impossible. Roads that should have carried supplies and reinforcements forward were instead clogged with retreating German soldiers, abandoned equipment, and civilian refugees fleeing the advancing Americans. General Pershing, sensing that the German army was finally beginning to crack, ordered his commanders to maintain maximum pressure regardless of the cost in American casualties. Fresh divisions that had been held in reserve were thrown into the battle, and American artillery maintained a continuous bombardment of German positions, even as they were being evacuated. The goal was to prevent the Germans from establishing new defensive lines and to keep them in constant retreat. The American advance took on characteristics that had been absent from previous phases of the offensive. Instead of grinding forward yard by yard against prepared positions, American units found themselves pursuing a retreating enemy across relatively open ground. Cavalry units, which had been relegated to rear area duties throughout most of the war, suddenly found themselves useful again, as mounted troops could move faster than infantry across the broken terrain. Lieutenant George Patton, recovered from wounds suffered earlier in the offensive, led his tanks in pursuit of retreating German forces. His unit covered more ground in a single day than they had advanced in the previous month of fighting. Patton's after-action reports, preserved in the Patton Papers at the Library of Congress, describe the exhilaration of finally fighting a mobile battle after months of static trench warfare. German rearguard actions became increasingly desperate. As the retreat continued, elite units of the German army, including elements of the Prussian Guard, were sacrificed in holding actions designed to buy time for the main body of German forces to escape encirclement. These units fought with the skill and determination that had made the German army famous, but they were overwhelmed by American numbers and firepower. The town of Sedan, a symbolic objective for the American forces due to its significance in the Vichy Franco-Prussian War of 1870, became the focus of a race between American and French forces. Both armies wanted the honor of liberating the historic town, and the competition led to some of the most rapid advances of the entire war. American units covered distances in hours that would have taken days during the earlier phases of the offensive. According to documentation from the World War I Centennial Commission, German supply lines collapsed completely during this phase of the retreat. Ammunition shortages that had been developing for weeks became critical, forcing German artillery units to conserve shells and limiting their ability to support the retreating infantry. Food shortages led to widespread malnutrition among German troops, further reducing their effectiveness in combat. American forces encountered increasing numbers of German soldiers willing to surrender rather than continue fighting. Prisoner of war camps, hastily established behind the advancing American lines, overflowed with German captives. Many of these prisoners expressed relief at being out of the war and spoke of the hopelessness they had felt as American forces continued to advance. Despite enormous casualties, the German withdrawal also revealed the extent of the defensive works they had constructed during 4 years of occupation. American soldiers discovered vast underground complexes with electric lighting, hospitals, and living quarters that could house thousands of soldiers. These installations represented millions of hours of forced labor by Belgian and French civilians, and their abandonment demonstrated how complete the German defeat had become. Civilian populations in the liberated areas emerged from cellars and hiding places where they had sheltered during the fighting. Their accounts of German occupation, documented by American intelligence officers, provided evidence of the harsh treatment of non-combatants that had characterized German rule. These Stories would later influence American attitudes toward Germany during the post-war period. Capabilities during the war. Units that had struggled with basic tactical coordination in September were now executing complex combined arms operations involving infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The American Expeditionary Forces had become a formidable military machine, capable of defeating the best troops Germany could field. November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns fell silent along the Western Front. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, which had begun 47 days earlier with such high hopes and desperate fighting, came to an end not with a final climactic battle, but with an eerie quiet that soldiers on both sides found almost more unsettling than the constant noise of combat. The armistice that ended the fighting found American forces in positions that would have seemed impossible when the offensive began. The First Army had advanced over 30 miles from their starting positions, captured thousands of German prisoners, and seized hundreds of artillery pieces and machine guns. More importantly, they had broken the back of German resistance in their sector and contributed significantly to the collapse of German morale that led to the armistice. General Pershing received the news of the armistice with mixed emotions. While relieved that the killing had finally stopped, he believed that the war should have continued until German forces were completely defeated and occupied. His diary entries, preserved at the Library of Congress, reveal his concern that allowing Germany to surrender while its army was still in the field might lead to future conflicts. History would prove his concerns prophetic. The cost of the Meuse-Argonne offensive in human terms was staggering. American casualties totaled over 120,000 men, including 26,000 dead. These numbers represented the highest casualty count for any battle in American military history, exceeding even the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War. Every American family seemed to know someone who had died in the Argonne forest or been wounded in the fighting around the Meuse River. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true extent of the destruction that had been wrought. The Argonne forest, once a pristine wilderness area, had been transformed into a wasteland of broken trees, shell craters, and abandoned equipment. According to reports from the American Graves Registration Service, it took over 2 years to locate and properly bury all the American dead from the offensive. Medal of Honor recipients from the Meuse-Argonne offensive numbered more than from any other battle in American history. Sergeant Alvin York became the most famous, but dozens of other soldiers received the nation's highest decoration for extraordinary heroism during the fighting. Their stories, preserved in military records and popular accounts, became part of American folklore and helped establish the reputation of the American soldier as a formidable fighting man. The German perspective on the battle, documented in post-war interviews and memoirs, revealed the impact that American forces had made on veteran German troops. Many German officers expressed surprise at the determination and fighting ability of American soldiers, whom they had initially dismissed as inexperienced and poorly trained. The sustained pressure that American forces maintained throughout the offensive had worn down German resistance in a way that previous Allied attacks had failed to achieve. The strategic impact of the Meuse-Argonne offensive extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. The successful American operation demonstrated that the United States had become a major military power capable of fielding and sustaining large armies in combat. This newfound military capability would influence American foreign policy for decades to come and establish the United States as a global superpower. Technological innovations developed during the offensive would influence military doctrine for years to come. The coordination of artillery, infantry, tanks, and aircraft that characterized the later phases of the battle became the model for combined arms operations in future conflicts. American military leaders studied the lessons learned in the Argonne forest and incorporated them into training programs and tactical manuals. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive also marked the coming of age of the American military as an independent force. Throughout most of the war, American units had fought under British or French command, but the offensive was planned and executed by American commanders using American methods. This independence from European military traditions established patterns that would characterize American military operations throughout the 20th century. Veterans of the Meuse Argonne offensive returned home to a nation that was struggling to understand the magnitude of what they had accomplished and endured. Many found it difficult to readjust to civilian life after experiencing the intensity of combat in the Argonne forest. Their stories, told in letters, memoirs, and oral histories, provide a lasting testament to the courage and sacrifice of the American soldiers who fought in the bloodiest battle of American military history, the memory of the Meuse Argonne offensive. Lives on in American military tradition, serving as a reminder of the price of freedom and the courage of those who fight to defend it. The men who died in the forests and fields of eastern France gave their lives not just for their own country, but for the principle that democracy and freedom are worth any sacrifice. Their legacy continues to inspire American soldiers today, just as it did their comrades who survived to tell their story.